Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film a wrap-up video of the books that I read in August and maybe one from September that I have not yet wrapped up on this channel. Definitely behind on wrap-ups this year. I keep letting that get away from me, and I do apologize for that, but you know, that's the way life goes sometimes. So there are several books in here that I talked about extensively in my mid-month book bash vlog from August, so I'm just going to touch on them briefly without any real in-depth analysis because I talked about them quite a bit. So if you want to hear more about those books, feel free to jump on back to the vlogs from August. So the first thing that I completed in August was a book that I did talk about in July, actually, because I started it in July, and that was The Quiet Damage, QAnon and the Destruction of the American Family by Jesselyn Cook. And I want to thank Crown Publishing for sending me this book to read and review. And this is a journalist's account of 5 different families that were ripped apart when one member of that family became obsessed with conspiracy theories pushed by this QAnon group. And these are very destructive conspiracy theories that have no basis in reality. And they're basically being brought forward by disaffected people online, and for various reasons. Like, each of the families were very different demographically, white families, black families, like all across the spectrum of wealth and poverty. And it didn't matter if there's reasons why people are susceptible to these kinds of conspiracy theories. And this book was a real eye-opener for me. I'm so glad that I read it because it really helped me understand this whole phenomenon that's happening with QAnon and these types of far-right type conspiracy theories. It's very, very scary stuff. And I am glad, even though it was quite creepy and quite disturbing to read this, I'm glad to have this information in my brain. I then finished a historical fiction / mystery called The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. This was a book I borrowed from the library, and it was also a buddy read with Britta Bowler. And this is a fictionalized account of a real life person. Martha Ballard was a midwife in the area around Hollowell, Maine in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And I've read the Pulitzer Prize winning nonfiction book based on her diaries. That was excellent. And this book takes that real person and imagines what it would have been like if she had been involved in a murder case. And so that's what this story is. It takes place in 1789. And a person is found dead in the river, frozen in the river in the middle of a winter time in Maine. And that person's death sort of spirals out and gets Martha involved in a lot of secrets in the town, in the community in which she lives. And she finds out a lot of things because she is the midwife. She is the person that's traveling around and going into people's homes and helping women who are pregnant, helping women birth children. And so she has this very insider knowledge of her community. It was an excellent, excellent read. I very much enjoyed it. I'm not a big historical fiction type of a person, but I really enjoyed this story set in Maine, which is not a place that you often see as a setting in that type of a book, and it was excellent to have it be based on a real life person. The next thing I finished was a book that I read because it's on my bucket list, and that is the Dark Tower series. I read the second book in that series, The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. This particular edition of the book has illustrations, full page color illustrations. This was my mother-in-law's copy of the book. She was a huge Stephen King fan. It was something that we bonded over. But I have never read the Dark Tower series. And so I'm trying this year to work my way through that. And this was the second book, and it was a rip snorter of a good time. These are dark fantasy novels in which you're following this guy, a gunslinger, in this parallel world to ours. And he is in this particular edition, he's drawing together his partners, his compatriots, as he's trying to complete his quest. And I don't really want to go into it any more than that, because I think that this is the type of series that really all of the books, you have to read them in order, and they're all like just a continuation of the story. And so you really can't get into the details, but they're extremely violent. they are very much, there's always like some kind of side plot with drug addiction in Stephen King's books, or very often there are. And this one's no different. Lots of violence. This one has a weird mobster connection. So yeah, I had a fun time with this book. Then 2 books that I read during Mid-Month Book Bash in August that I won't go into because neither one were very successful for me, and I talked about them quite a bit in that vlog. The first was Heart, A History by Sandeep Jauhar. And this was a book that was on my ancient TBR, which was why I picked it up and read it that month. I have since gotten rid of that book, so I do not have it in my possession any longer. And then I read The Memory Police by Yōko Ogawa, translated by Stephen Snyder, and I read that for Women in Translation in August. Again, that book was not successful for me, and so those 2 books have gone out of my home. I completed Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times by Kenneth Whyte. This was a book for my presidential reading challenge. It was the biography I read for Herbert Hoover, and so all I knew about Herbert Hoover was that the big dam, the Hoover Dam out in the western part of the U.S. was named after him, and that he was largely seen as having made the conditions worse leading into the Great Depression, and then was unable to like pull the country out of that crisis, and then was defeated by FDR afterwards. But this book tells, of course, being a biography, it tells his whole life story. And Hoover was a much more interesting person than his sort of place in presidential history has made him out to be. He was an excellent administrator, and as far as like logistics and organization, he was almost a genius. He was able to, in World War I, single-handedly save the lives of tens of thousands of Americans who were stuck in Europe when the onset of that war happened. And he was able to organize the saving of millions of starving Europeans during that war. He was the one that facilitated food relief for Europeans during and after World War I. And like his accomplishments in this area are tremendous, but he was a terrible president. He was a terrible American president because he, and I don't think that it's true that he is seen as being very heartless towards the people who were out of work and starving in the United States during the Great Depression. And he obviously wasn't really that way because he had been so instrumental in providing food aid to other places in the world when starvation times had hit. But he really thought that it wasn't his place to put the finger of the American president on the economy. He was very much a believer of, limited government, that things should be left to the local governments and the state governments to handle, and to private philanthropy and that sort of thing. He did not think it was the place of the federal government to intervene in these types of issues. And so he allowed this situation to get much worse than it needed to get, in my opinion, during the Great Depression. So very interesting biography. I did listen to that one on an audiobook, and it's over 27 hours long, but I will say it held my interest. His life was not boring. And I will say he was not very old when he was defeated for his second term of president. I think he was only in his 50s. And so he had a long time after he was president to sort of be bitter about what had happened to him, or what he felt had happened to him, and how he felt his legacy was being documented, and how unfair he felt that was. And so a lot of the documentation that we have on Hoover came from that long time period after he was president, when he felt very much like nobody understood him. He felt very misunderstood by the country and by the media and all that sort of thing. So that was a very interesting biography, and I'm glad that I read that because it gave me a much better understanding, and it made me be very interested in reading more about the Great Depression, that part of history of the United States. So if anybody has a recommendation for a good nonfiction book about the Great Depression, I am all ears. I then finished another buddy read book, another nonfiction. This was 7 Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. This is a book written by an Indigenous author. She is a member of Indigenous community in what we now know as Canada. And she is also a journalist, and she wrote this book about detailing the situation in a city in Ontario, Thunder Bay, where between the period of 2000 and 2011, 7 Indigenous high school students died. And the systemic racism and lack of attention to what was happening to these children really is distressing. These were children who had been brought from there, and because not necessarily forcefully, but because there were no educational opportunities in their very remote Indigenous communities in northern Canada, they would come to these children would come to Thunder Bay to go to high school. And there was a particular, 2 high schools in the area that were set up to provide education for these types of youths, but they had to be brought from these remote communities where they had never encountered urban living before. They had never seen streetlights. They had never seen a McDonald's, so they bring these high school teenagers into this urban environment, and basically they would stay with host families, and the host families in many cases were not providing appropriate supervision to these teenagers. The school was not providing appropriate supervision, and so there was lots of opportunities for teenagers to sort of roam around the city and be introduced to drugs and alcohol, and to be put into situations where they were abused by other non-Indigenous members of the community. There was a lot of violence and that sort of thing. And so Talaga was researching what had happened to these young people, because the police, basically, when these young people were found, they would either say it was accidental or it was suicide, and they didn't investigate. And in many cases, there are a lot of questions around what the causes of death were for these young people. And it's just tragic and horrible. And it just made me think, reading this, I was reading it with my buddy reader, Rachel, and we both kept saying, why wasn't anybody paying attention? Where was the supervision? Where were the adults in these young people's lives? Why? But there just wasn't the resources, There was not the resources to provide these young people with the structure and the guidance and the, safety net that they really needed. And it's just tragic. And Canada really, the government, the federal government, who had an obligation to, at the very least, investigate what was happening with these young people, really fell down on the job, and probably continues to fall down on the job, if we're being honest. So yeah, it was a real eye-opening book, not a fun read by any means, but it was an important read, and I am glad that I got to it. And then I read these next couple of books, library books. I went through a real library, really got obsessed with my library in the month of August, which was awesome. I borrowed Wolfsong by TJ Klune, which is the first book in the Green Creek series. This is urban fantasy, and in this first book, we're following a character named Ox. And Ox is in the time that the story starts, he's just a boy in this community, I think in the Pacific Northwest. And he has been told by his dad that he is basically dumb and he's never going to amount to anything, and that he just needs to understand that his life is not going to be anything important. And then his dad takes off. And then Ox is left with this, self-esteem in the toilet, and he struggles in school. He really has a difficult time, ordering his thoughts, and, he just has some issues, and nobody sort of is aware of the fact that maybe these issues are not maybe he could be helped with some of these issues. And then a family moves in next door, and that family is a group of shapeshifters, and Ox becomes connected with this family of shapeshifters, and it changes his life. And this is a story of found family and romance, and like I said, it's fantasy because we have shapeshifters and we have other fantastical creatures. This book I enjoyed. I did not enjoy it as much as the other books that I read by TJ Klune, which are Under a Cerulean Sea, and the one that just came out that I read last month. Something about, can't remember the name of that one, but I read those 2 books, and those are very cozy, found family type fantasy novels. This one is way more violent, and Wolfsong is way more violent and much more sexually explicit. So please don't pick this up thinking you're going to get another very gentle, cozy fantasy in the style of Under the Cerulean Sea. Because you will be shocked. So I don't mind that in my urban fantasy. I read other urban fantasies that have a similar level of spice and violence, and so I didn't mind that aspect of it. But it was kind of surprising because I was expecting it to be in the same vein as those other books, but it definitely was not. But it was still an enjoyable story. I will say I found Ox to be quite stubborn, and really the central romantic relationship that he has is a little bit there's some age differences going on, and that's can feel a little bit uncomfortable. So yeah, I didn't love this one, but I did like it enough to want to continue to read on and see, because you follow other characters from this story in the subsequent books. So I think I will continue on with that. My library does have all the books in this series. And if you like queer, urban fantasy type series, you might want to give this one a try. I then borrowed Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by Heather Cox Richardson. And I was inspired to pick this one up because I started following Heather Cox Richardson's newsletter. She has a newsletter, a Substack called Notes from an American. And I listened to that as basically you can get it as an audio, like a podcast episode. It's a daily newsletter. And I started listening to that as a podcast type thing. And she is she's a history professor at MIT, I think. Anyway, a college in Massachusetts, and lives in Maine. She's married to a lobsterman in Maine. And so a friend of mine had recommended her newsletter, and I really got interested in that. I think it's very good. It really talks about democracy from the aspect of historical perspectives of the founding of our country and our democratic ideals. Explaining what is happening today and how either we are or are not sort of meeting what was envisioned for how our country should be governed. And I think she's very intelligent about these things, and she has a lot of historical knowledge, and I appreciate that. And she's also very straightforward in her approach, how she talks about it. So her book, Democracy Awakening, explains how a small group of wealthy people have influenced American ideals and democracy over the course of history, from the founding of the country until current day. And I found it in the same vein as These Truths by Jill Lepore. Like, it has that same type of feel. And I just am so appreciative of American history written by women and women scholars, and that perspective, which I think has been lacking in a lot of American history nonfiction, because it was all written from one perspective, and I like reading it from all these other perspectives. And so I think if you like your history really straightforward, and you want some sort of practical explanations for how we got here into our current political climate, I would definitely recommend checking out Heather Cox Richardson's newsletter, Notes from an American. I think it's really excellently done. I then read Gator Country, Deception, Danger, and Alligators in the Everglades by Rebecca Renner. Listened to this on audiobook. This was a book that was on the BookTube Prize, like on the original 48 books. It got knocked out before I was ever assigned it, so I didn't read it for BookTube Prize. But Doris over at Aldi Books had read it and said it was really good. And she and I like, obviously, a lot of the same type of nature and science books. And so I decided to listen to it. And it was a really great audiobook. Rebecca Renner is a reporter, and she embedded herself in rural communities in Florida to investigate the story of an undercover, a man who was a game warden who went undercover for several years to try to catch people who were selling alligator eggs illegally. So I learned so much stuff I did not know from this book. So there is a huge alligators are grown, alligators that are eaten for food are grown on farms in places like Florida and Louisiana and other places where the climate is appropriate for alligators. And it's aquaculture. It's basically aquaculture for alligators, and they're grown in these ponds on people's properties. But you can't, like, alligators don't like to procreate in captivity. So like, it's very difficult to get alligators to like breed when people are watching them, or like when they're in captivity or being grown on these farm type situations. And so, but they produce quite well in the wild. And so that you can get a permit to collect eggs from the wild from alligators, and then take those eggs and raise those subsequent baby alligators on your farm for aquaculture purposes. And so there's, a whole system for how that's supposed to be done. But of course, there are people who are playing that system and taking too many eggs and basically poaching alligator eggs and selling those products on. They're poaching them in Florida and selling them on to other states like Louisiana, to other alligator farms. And they're like forging the paperwork, and like the people who are buying the eggs maybe think they're buying real, like, legitimate eggs, or maybe they know and they're all involved in it. And so like this book is like documenting like, how does this work and what's really going on and who are really the bad guys and who are just like regular people that sort of get caught up in the situation because they're super poor, and like this seems like a way to make a quick bunch of money. And if you're really poor, like, is it so bad to sell a couple alligator eggs to like make rent or whatever? Like, would we, like, there's social issues like around people hunting and gathering in places where hunting and gathering always occurred. And because I live in a state where hunting and gathering is also a traditional practice, and now there are laws and regulations around how and when and why you can do those activities, like, I think there's a lot of ethical questions around, whether you're doing it for sport is one thing, or just because you like to destroy shit, like, that's one thing. But if you're doing it because you're hungry, that's another issue. So I think that this book like touches on a lot of these ethical considerations of hunting and gathering in a way that I found really interesting. Also touches on like indigenous access to these resources, from tribes that lived in Florida or other places that, this is a traditional way of life for them. And what do these, formation of these state parks or national parks, like, what does that mean for access? I thought it was a really good book, and I really enjoyed listening to it. And of course, the central story of this game warden who goes undercover is very exciting. And like, is he going to get found out and killed or left in a swamp? It was quite a good read. I really enjoyed it. I then borrowed Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World by Naomi Klein. And this was another book that had been on the BookTube Prize list that I never was assigned, and it got knocked out before the final round. And I thought this was excellent. This is one of the best pieces of nonfiction I've read all year. So Naomi Klein is an author that I've read previously. I really enjoy her nonfiction science writing about climate issues. So she's quite a activist and a person sounding the alarm about the climate crisis and about capitalism and what capitalism is driving us to do in terms of the environment. And this book, Doppelganger, is her rumination and description of what it's like when people mistake you for somebody else on the internet. So she keeps getting confused with another famous Naomi Wolf, who is a person who used to write about feminist issues and then sort of like went off the deep end with the alt-right and is now like super on the conservative side of the political spectrum, which is so bizarre considering where she started out writing about feminism. So, and Naomi Klein keeps getting mistaken online. Like, people keep conflating them and confusing them. And so she like spent a lot of time in the beginning when this first started happening, like trying to tell people, I'm not her. These are my ideas. Those are her ideas. And like trying to separate herself, and then realizing like it was a losing battle that she was fighting, and she needed to just like get over it and like focus on her own life. But she, in the process of like dealing with that personal situation, she talks about like online culture and how destructive and detrimental a lot of online culture is to us as people, as a culture, different aspects of how social media works and how being online all the time has hurt people. And I thought it was really interesting exploration. I think, you know, there have been various books that have come out in the last few years that have sort of been about this topic. But because Naomi Klein has this personal aspect to it, I think that made it more interesting to me. But I found it quite enthralling and engaging, and I think is a really worthwhile piece of nonfiction and very appropriate for where we are in the current day. And then last but not least is a book I started it in August and I finished it up at the beginning of September. And that was an Elizabeth George Detective Lindley novel. This is A Place of Hiding. Of course, I'm buddy reading this whole series with Britta Buller. This is book number 12 in the series. And this one's kind of an offshoot a little bit. Inspector Lindley is basically not in this book. Detective Havers is basically not in this book. We're following two of the other side characters from the series, St. James and his wife, Deborah. Deborah, a friend from her past shows back up in her life. And this friend and his sister, the sister's been accused of murder on Guernsey Island and is in jail. And the brother has come to ask Deb for help. Like, can you help me get my sister out of jail? She didn't commit this murder. I know she didn't. And so Deborah and her husband go to Guernsey Island. St. James is a forensic pathologist, is best friends with Lindley. And so they find themselves getting sucked into this mystery, right? And trying to prove that Deborah's friend did not, in fact, commit this murder. And there are all these secrets being kept on this island because, of course, Guernsey was an island that was occupied by the Germans during World War II. And there were people who were collaborators with the Germans and there were people who were resisting the Germans. And like the current day people, you know, are the ancestors, in a lot of cases, the relatives of the people that were alive in that time. But there are a few older members of the community that were alive during the occupation. And there are secrets that are being kept about that. And so A Place of Hiding refers to a lot of the secrets, a lot of the things that were tucked away to hide that are in relation to what happened during World War II. It's a very complex mystery. It kept me guessing throughout. I thought it was really well done. It's one of my favorite installments in the whole series. I really enjoyed the location. I enjoyed the fact that we were following these two secondary characters from the series. And it did not feel like it was just like distracting us from what's going on with our main characters. It felt like this was an excellent, almost a standalone mystery novel. But I really enjoyed my time with this one. So those are all the books that I read in August and one in September that I hadn't yet talked about. And I wanted to make sure that I did get a chance to talk about them because there are some really excellent books in this group. I hope you have all been doing some good reading, finding some great books, and I will talk to you later.